In 15 years of judging talent shows, Simon Cowell had never left his seat during a live audition. Not once. But when 83-year-old Margaret Thompson stepped onto the Britain's Got Talent stage, clutching a worn photograph and speaking words that would shatter every rule of television, Simon did something that left 3,000 audience members speechless and changed the show forever. The London Palladium was buzzing with its usual Saturday evening energy. Contestants waited nervously in the wings while families filled every seat, hoping to witness the next viral moment. Simon sat at the judges' table in his signature black t-shirt, arms crossed, that familiar expression of skeptical anticipation etched across his face. He'd seen everything, or so he thought. Margaret Thompson shuffled onto the stage slowly, her walking cane tapping against the polished floor with each measured step. She wore a simple floral dress that had clearly seen better decades, and her silver hair was carefully styled in gentle waves. At 83, she was easily the oldest contestant of the season, but there was something in her posture, something determined about the way she held her chin up, that caught Simon's attention immediately. "Hello, love," Aunt McPartlin called out warmly from his hosting position. "What's your name?" "Margaret Thompson," she replied, her voice carrying the refined accent of someone who had spent decades teaching proper English. "But my students always called me Mrs. T. And how old are you, Margaret?" Dec Donnelly asked with genuine curiosity. 83 years young," she said with a smile that lit up her entire face, though my knees would argue that point. The audience chuckled, already charmed by her warmth. Simon leaned forward slightly, intrigued despite himself. Amanda Holden beamed from her seat, while Alessia Dixon and David Williams exchanged glances that said they were already rooting for this sweet grandmother. "What brings you to BGT today?" Amanda asked. Margaret's expression shifted then, becoming more serious. She reached into a small purse hanging from her arm and carefully extracted a black and white photograph. Even from the judges' table, they could see it was old, the edges worn from decades of handling. "I'm here because of a promise I made to my late husband, Harold," Margaret said, holding up the photograph so the cameras could capture it. 58 years ago, he was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease when he was only 35. The doctors said he had maybe 10 years left. The Palladium grew quieter. This wasn't the usual BGT sob story. There was something different in Margaret's voice, something that commanded respect rather than pity. "Harold was a jazz musician," she continued, her eyes never leaving the photograph. "Piano was his life, but as the Parkinsons progressed, his hands, well, they couldn't do what his heart wanted them to do anymore." Simon's expression had changed completely. The skeptical mask had slipped away, replaced by something softer, more attentive. "For 43 years, I watched this brilliant man struggle with a body that wouldn't obey him, but he never stopped loving music. Every day he would sit at our old piano and try to play, even when his fingers wouldn't cooperate. And every day, I would sit beside him and sing the melodies he could no longer create." Margaret paused, looking directly at Simon. 3 months ago, Harold passed away, and on his deathbed, he made me promise something that seemed impossible for a woman my age. The silence in the venue was absolute. Not a cough, not a whisper. 3,000 people holding their breath. He said, "Margaret, you have the most beautiful voice I've ever heard, and I've been selfish keeping it to myself for all these years. Promise me you'll share it with the world. Promise me you'll audition for that show we always watch together, Britain's Got Talent. Promise me you'll sing our song." David Williams wiped his eyes. Amanda had her hand pressed to her heart. Alessia was openly crying. And Simon was staring at Margaret with an intensity that the cameras caught in perfect detail. "So here I am," Margaret said, tucking the photograph back into her purse. "Terrified, but keeping my word to the love of my life. What song will you be performing for us?" Aunt asked gently. "The Way You Look Tonight," Margaret replied. "It was our wedding song in 1962. Harold proposed to me while Sinatra played it on the radio in his little flat in Manchester." Simon cleared his throat. "Margaret," he said, his voice unusually soft, "before you sing, I have to ask, have you ever performed professionally?" Margaret shook her head. "Never. Harold always said I should, but I was too frightened, too insecure. I spent 40 years teaching primary school children, and that was enough stage time for me. But promises to dying husbands, well, they change a person's perspective on fear. That's when something unprecedented happened." Simon stood up from the judges' table. The audience murmured in confusion. In 15 years of judging, Simon Cowell had never left his seat during an audition. Never. The cameras zoomed in on his face as he walked around the table and approached the stage. "Margaret," he said, his voice carrying across the venue without amplification. I need to tell you something before you sing. Margaret looked down at him, puzzled but unafraid. I've been doing this job for a very long time, Simon continued. I've heard thousands of auditions. I've seen every type of performer you can imagine. But I have never, and I mean never, heard a more beautiful story about love, about devotion, about keeping promises even when they terrify you. The audience was completely silent, sensing they were witnessing something extraordinary. You see, Margaret, my father died of a heart attack when I was young, and there are things I never got to say to him, promises I never got to make, moments I never got to share. What you're doing here, honoring Harold's memory, keeping your word to him even at 83 years old, that's the bravest thing I've ever seen on this stage. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. So before you sing a single note, Simon said, I want you to know that you've already won, not the competition, that's not mine to decide alone. But you've won something more important. You've reminded everyone in this room what real courage looks like. Then Simon did something that broke every rule of television production. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. Right there, in front of 3,000 people and millions of viewers, he started recording. This isn't for the show, he announced. This is for Harold, because wherever he is, he deserves to see this moment. Margaret pressed her hand to her heart, overwhelmed by the gesture. Now, Simon said, stepping back but remaining near the stage instead of returning to his seat, please sing for Harold. Sing for everyone who's ever been too afraid to chase their dreams. Sing for love that lasts beyond death. The music began, a gentle classic arrangement of The Way You Look Tonight, and when Margaret opened her mouth to sing, something magical happened. Her voice was pure velvet, rich and warm with the kind of emotional depth that only comes from 8 decades of living, loving, and losing. She wasn't technically perfect. There were small imperfections that any voice coach would notice, but she was absolutely stunning. As she sang, Margaret's eyes closed, and it was clear she wasn't performing for the audience anymore. She was singing to Harold, wherever he was. The Palladium had become their living room, the stage their old piano bench, and everyone else had simply been invited to witness a love song that transcended death. By the second verse, there wasn't a dry eye in the venue. Amanda was sobbing openly. David had given up trying to hide his tears. Alicia was recording on her own phone, unable to look away. And Simon was still standing, still recording, tears streaming down his face without shame or embarrassment. When Margaret finished, the silence lasted for exactly 7 seconds, 7 seconds of absolute reverent quiet. Then the Palladium exploded in applause that lasted nearly 4 minutes. The standing ovation was immediate and unanimous. Even the backstage crew, the cameramen, the sound technicians, everyone was on their feet. But the most extraordinary moment came next. Simon walked onto the stage, something he had never done during an audition in 15 years of judging. He approached Margaret, and without saying a word, pulled her into a gentle embrace. Harold heard every note, he whispered in her ear. I promise you, he heard every note. When they separated, Simon turned to face the audience and his fellow judges. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his voice thick with emotion, I've been doing this job for 15 years. I've given out golden buzzers. I've seen incredible talent. I've watched dreams come true, but I have never been more honored to share a stage with someone than I am right now. He looked back at Margaret. You didn't just sing a song tonight. You showed us what real love looks like, what keeping promises means, what courage sounds like when it's wrapped in melody. Then Simon did something else unprecedented. He reached for the golden buzzer, his golden buzzer, the one he saved for the most exceptional acts of each season. Margaret, he said, I'm not just putting you through to the next round, I'm sending you straight to the live shows. Because some performances aren't about competition, they're about celebration. And tonight, we're celebrating love, courage, and the most beautiful promise I've ever witnessed being kept. Golden confetti rained down from the ceiling as Margaret stood in shock, hand over her mouth. The other judges rushed onto the stage to embrace her. The audience was on their feet again, many of them crying and cheering simultaneously. But perhaps the most touching moment came when Simon showed Margaret his phone screen, the video he had recorded of her performance. This is going to Harold, he said, because wherever he is, he needs to see what his love inspired. He needs to know that his promise was kept, and it was beautiful. 6 months later, Margaret Thompson made it to the BGT finals, finishing in 3rd place with a performance that the judges called transcendent. But more importantly, she started a foundation called Harold's Promise, encouraging elderly people to pursue dreams they'd abandoned, to take chances they'd been too afraid to take. Simon Cowell funded the foundation's first year personally, and every year since, on the anniversary of Margaret's audition, He posts that phone recording on his social media with the same caption, "Some promises are too beautiful to break. Some love is too strong for death to silence." Margaret still performs regularly at local venues around Manchester, always ending her sets with, "The way you look tonight." And at every performance, she saves one seat in the front row, Harold's seat she calls it. Because some promises, once made, last forever. The photograph she carried onto the BGT stage now sits on Simon's desk in his London office, a daily reminder that sometimes the most powerful moments happen when you stop being a judge and start being human. When you recognize that some stories are bigger than entertainment, some voices carry more than melody, and some promises are worth breaking every rule to honor.